The granite teeth of the peaks bit into a sky the color of a fresh bruise, spitting snow that was less like flakes and more like fine, stinging dust. Caleb felt the cold not in his skin, which was thick as winter leather, but deep in the marrow of his bones, a familiar ache that told him the year was dying, and the real winter, the one that buried the world and starved the wolves, was about to be born. His cabin was a 2-day trek behind him, a fortress of pine and river stone nestled in a high valley that few men had ever seen and none had ever tried to claim. He stood on the last ridge overlooking the sad, shivering town of Redemption, a place he visited only when necessity clawed at him, twice a year if he was lucky, 3 times if he was not. The town was a smear of gray wood and dirty smoke against the endless white. Down there, men spoke in clipped, suspicious tones and measured a man's worth by the coin in his pocket, not the sureness of his hands or the truth in his eyes. Caleb adjusted the heavy elk pelts on his shoulders, his own long dark hair and thick beard already frosted with ice. He was a colossal man, built of the mountain itself, his silence as vast and profound as the wilderness he called home. He needed salt, flour, and coffee, essentials that his traps and his rifle could not provide. It was Christmas Eve, a fact he only knew because the last time he'd been down, the store owner had been complaining about ordering holiday stock. For the people below, it meant hymns and warmth. For Caleb, it meant the year's final, most dangerous supply run before the passes became impassable tombs of snow. He began his descent, his heavy boots sinking deep, each step a reluctant surrender to the world of men he had long since abandoned. The air grew thicker, heavier with the smell of coal smoke and misery, a stark contrast to the clean, sharp scent of pine and frozen earth that was his life. He pushed open the door to the general store, the sudden wave of cloying heat and the low murmur of voices a physical assault on his senses. The men clustered around the pot-bellied stove fell silent, turning as one to look at the giant who filled the doorway, bringing the scent of the wild and the chill of the grave with him. Caleb ignored them, his eyes scanning the shelves, his mind already calculating the weight of his pack for the punishing journey home. The store owner, a nervous man named Fletcher with a perpetually damp brow, scurried from behind the counter. "Caleb, didn't expect to see you down, not with this storm coming in." Caleb gave a curt nod, his gaze settling on a sack of flour. "Need supplies." His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a creek. As Fletcher began to measure out the goods, the conversation by the stove resumed, its tone lowered but no less audible. It was the town sheriff Brody speaking, his words thick with irritation. "I don't care what you do with her, just get her out of my jail. She ain't broke no law, and I can't be feeding a stray. It's Christmas, for God's sake." Another man chimed in. "What was Henderson thinking, buying one of them mail-order things from the coast and then just leaving her when his claim went bust? Left her with nothing but that red dress." Brody grunted. "He was thinking with his britches. Now she's our problem. No one wants her. Can't speak a word of English. Scrawny thing. No good for farm work, and the ladies at the saloon say she's too broken-looking." Caleb continued to gather his things, the words washing over him like dirty water. He had no interest in the town's petty cruelties. He had seen enough of them to last a lifetime, but the sheriff's next words caught in his ear. "I'll give $20 to any man who'll take her off our hands. Marry her. Take her as a housekeeper, I don't care. Just get her out of Redemption before the snow buries us all." A cruel chuckle went through the small group. The idea was absurd. A Chinese girl, abandoned and bruised, was less than nothing out here. She was a burden, a mouth to feed through a hard winter. Caleb placed a heavy bag of salt on the counter, the thud drawing their attention again. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over their smug, weathered faces. The mountain had taught him a simple, brutal economy. Everything alive fought to stay that way. Waste was a sin against nature. Leaving something to die out of sheer inconvenience was a weakness he could not comprehend. His mind, usually occupied with the clear, sharp logic of survival, weather patterns, animal tracks, the heft of his axe, was suddenly clouded. He thought of the silence of his cabin, a silence that had once been a comfort but had lately begun to feel like a weight. He thought of the coming blizzard, a white monster that would swallow the world whole for months. To face that alone was his life, but to know someone else was facing a different kind of death, a death of indifference down in this stifling, mean-spirited town, stirred something cold and hard in his gut. He walked towards the group, his footsteps heavy on the worn floorboards. The men shifted, their casual cruelty evaporating in the face of his sheer physical presence. Sheriff Brody, a man used to being the authority, found himself looking up. "What is it, Caleb?" Caleb's eyes were the color of a winter sky just before the sun gives up. "The girl," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "The one you want gone." Brody's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief in them. "What about her?" "I'll take her." The silence in the store was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the stove. Fletcher froze with his hand in a barrel of beans. The men by the stove stared, mouths agape. It was an impossible statement. Caleb, the hermit, the mountain ghost, wanted the foreign burden? Brody recovered first, a slow, calculating look spreading across his face. "You'll take her? What, you aim to marry her?" Caleb gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture of pure dismissal. The legalities of the flatlands meant nothing on his mountain. "I'll take her off your hands. That's what you want, isn't it?" Brody exchanged a look with the other men. This was a perfect solution. Strange, but perfect. "All right," the sheriff said, his voice regaining its authority. $20 says she's yours, but you see her first. No surprises." Caleb followed him out of the suffocating warmth of the store and into the biting wind. The jail was a small, grim structure next door. Brody unlocked the door to a tiny cell. Huddled on a thin cot, trying to disappear into the stone wall, was a small figure wrapped in a threadbare blanket. All Caleb could see was a fall of straight black hair and the edge of a tattered garment, the color of dried blood. "Get up," Brody ordered gruffly. She rose slowly, letting the blanket fall. She was impossibly small, dressed in a red silk cheongsam, torn at the shoulder and stained with dirt. Her face was a canvas of suffering, a dark bruise swelling one cheek, a cut on her lip. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were dark and deep, and in them there was no pleading, no surrender. There was just a quiet, defiant flame that refused to be extinguished. She met his gaze without flinching. Caleb felt a strange jolt, a recognition of a resilience that matched the ancient stone of his own mountain. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a worn $20 gold piece, and pressed it into Brody's hand without breaking his gaze from the girl. "Get my supplies ready," he said to the sheriff over his shoulder. "We're leaving." The journey up the mountain was a silent battle against the escalating storm. The wind howled a mournful song through the pines, and the snow was no longer dust, but a thick, wet curtain that blinded them to anything more than a few feet ahead. Caleb moved with a relentless, ground-eating pace, his knowledge of the terrain the only thing keeping them on the unseen path. The girl, he did not know her name, had not asked, followed behind him, a small, crimson figure against the overwhelming white. She stumbled often, her thin shoes useless in the deepening drifts. He had given her one of his spare blankets to wrap around her shoulders, but he could see the shivers that racked her small frame. He never looked back, but he listened. He tracked her progress by the soft crunch of her footsteps, the sharp intake of her breath, the rustle of the wool blanket. When those sounds faltered, he would stop, waiting for them to resume before moving on. He was not a kind man. He did not know how to be. His actions were born of a brutal practicality. She was his responsibility now, a piece of living cargo he had to get to the safety of his cabin. Letting her freeze to death on the mountainside was an unacceptable failure. After 2 hours of relentless climbing, her steps ceased altogether. He stopped, listening. There was only the wind. He turned. She was on her knees in the snow, her head bowed, her strength finally gone. For a moment he considered leaving her there. The thought was cold and sharp, a voice from the solitary part of him that had kept him alive for so long. It would be easier. But then he saw the defiant set of her shoulders, the way she was still trying to push herself up, her hands trembling in the snow. He strode back, the distance between them vanishing in 3 huge steps. Without a word, he slung his supply pack to his front, bent down, and lifted her. She made a small, startled sound, her body stiff with fear. She weighed almost nothing. He arranged her on his back, her small arms instinctively going around his neck, her face pressed against the rough wool of his coat. He adjusted his hold, making sure the blanket was secure around her, and then he turned and continued his ascent, his burden now both physical and profound. He was a beast of the mountain, carrying this fragile, broken creature towards a future neither of them could possibly imagine. They reached the cabin as the last of the gray light bled from the sky, leaving the world a maelstrom of wind and roaring darkness. The small structure was a black silhouette against the churning snow, a haven of stillness in a world gone mad. Caleb pushed the heavy door open and carried her inside, kicking it shut against the storm. The immediate silence was a relief, the cold inside somehow less hostile than the shrieking violence without. He gently set her down on the single wooden chair by the cold hearth while he worked with an ingrained efficiency born of countless winters. He lit the lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows, revealing the Spartan interior, a sturdy bed, a table, shelves carved directly into the log walls, holding neatly stacked supplies. Then he turned to the fireplace, laying the kindling and logs with practiced ease. Within minutes a fire was crackling to life, its hungry flames casting dancing shadows on the walls and throwing out a wave of life-giving heat. The girl had not moved. She sat hunched in the chair, watching him with those same unnervingly steady eyes. He poured water from a bucket into a pot and set it near the fire to warm. He took a clean cloth from a shelf and dipped it into the heated water. He approached her slowly, as one would a wary animal. She flinched as he reached for her, a tremor running through her. "Hold still," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He gently tilted her chin up towards the firelight. Her face was pale beneath the dirt and the ugly purple bruise. The cut on her lip had started to bleed again. He began to clean the grime from her skin, his massive, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. As he wiped away the last of the dirt from her cheek, he paused. The firelight played across her features, illuminating the fine curve of her jaw, the straight line of her nose, the delicate arch of her brows. The hardness he had seen in the jail cell was still there, but now, stripped of the filth and despair of the town, he saw something else beneath it. He saw a startling, fragile beauty, not of the delicate, civilized women in the towns, but of something wild and resilient, like a winter rose blooming against all odds on a frozen cliff face. It was in that moment, looking at her properly for the first time, that Caleb froze. The world, which for him had always been a simple, brutal equation of survival, suddenly became infinitely more complex. He was looking at a person, not a problem he had solved or a burden he had shouldered. He was looking at Leanne. He didn't know how he knew her name, but it settled into his mind with the certainty of a star finding its place in the night sky. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes give way to a flicker of confusion, perhaps even curiosity. The chasm of silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken tension, a question that neither of them yet knew how to ask. The first days were a silent negotiation of space and existence. The blizzard raged outside, sealing them in a world of wood smoke and firelight. Caleb fell back into his familiar rhythms, checking his snares near the cabin, chopping wood, maintaining the quiet order of his solitary life. But every action was now shadowed by her presence. She was a quiet ghost in his home, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with her frailness. She never spoke. At first, she simply sat by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, watching everything with her dark, observant eyes. He would leave food for her on the table, a bowl of stew, a piece of hardtack, and turn away, giving her the privacy to eat. He slept on the floor by the hearth, leaving her the bed, a decision made without thought, an instinct he didn't examine. On the third day he woke to find the tattered red dress she had been wearing was gone from the corner where she'd left it. Instead, it was washed and hanging from a peg near the fire to dry, the torn silk painstakingly mended with thread she must have found in his small sewing kit. She was wearing one of his old, oversized flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times, the hem brushing her ankles. It made her look even smaller, a child playing dress-up. Yet there was a dignity in the act that silenced any such thought. It was a declaration. She was not the broken thing from the jail cell. She was a survivor, creating order from chaos. The silence began to change. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but a shared quiet, filled with the small sounds of their cohabitation. The soft whisk of the broom as she swept the floor, the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl, the whisper of her mending needle passing through cloth. She began to anticipate his needs. A mug of hot water would be waiting for him when he came in from the cold, his wet mittens placed carefully on the hearth to dry. In return, he started leaving things for her. A handful of dried berries he'd stored away, a particularly interesting feather from a blue jay he found in one of his traps. These were their conversations, small, silent offerings that spoke more than words ever could. He found himself watching her. He watched the way the firelight caught the blue-black sheen of her hair, the focused intensity in her eyes as she concentrated on a task, the surprising strength in her slender hands. The protective instinct he'd felt on the mountain was slowly, imperceptibly, transforming into something else, something warmer and more unsettling. He was a man who had built his life on the foundations of being alone, and he could feel those foundations starting to shift beneath his feet. The blizzard showed no signs of breaking. For 7 days, the world outside was nothing but a howling white void. The cabin, once Caleb's entire universe, now felt impossibly small. On the 8th night, a new sound joined the storm's chorus, a low, hungry howl that rose and fell with the wind. It was close, too close. Caleb went still, his head cocked, listening. The sound came again, a mournful, predatory cry that vibrated through the very logs of the cabin. A wolf, driven down from the high peaks by the storm and starvation. Leanne's head snapped up, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. He saw true fear in her for the first time. Not the resigned despair of the town, but the primal terror of a cornered animal. "It's just one," he said, his voice a low reassurance. "The cabin is strong." But the howling grew more frantic, joined by the scratching and snuffling of the beast at the door, testing the wood for any weakness. Caleb grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall, the familiar weight a comfort in his hands. He had no intention of using it unless he had to. A gunshot could trigger an avalanche on the overloaded slopes around them. This was a siege to be waited out. He moved to the single window, peering through a small gap in the shutter. In a swirl of snow he saw it, a large gray shadow, gaunt and desperate, its eyes glowing faintly in the reflected lantern light. It threw itself against the heavy oak door, which shuddered but held firm. He turned back to the room. Leanne was on her feet, her hands pressed to her mouth. The silent, capable woman was gone, replaced by a terrified girl. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to protect her, a feeling so powerful it startled him. He moved to the fireplace and added more logs, wanting the light and warmth to be a bulwark against the baying darkness outside. The wolf began to claw at the wooden shutter of the window, its snarls now audible over the wind. "The bar on the shutter," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. "It might be loose. We need to brace it." She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the spare wood axe from the corner while he dragged the heavy table, upending it against the window. Together, they worked in the flickering light, their movements synchronized by the shared threat. He wedged the table legs under the window frame while she used the axe handle to hammer a loose brace back into place. For a long moment, they stood side by side in the tense silence, listening to the frustrated snarling of the wolf. In the close confines, he could feel the warmth radiating from her, could smell the clean scent of wood smoke in her hair. The shared danger had dissolved the last of the space between them. She turned her head, her face pale in the lantern light, her eyes huge. "I am Leanne," she whispered, the words clear and strong despite her fear. It was the first time he had heard her voice properly. It was like music. He looked down at her, the great untamed mountain man and the small, resilient survivor. "Caleb," he replied, the name feeling solid and real as he gave it to her. The exchange was a pact, a formal acknowledgement made in the heart of the storm with a wolf at their door. The siege lasted 2 more days. The wolf, a persistent, starving ghost, circled the cabin, its howls a constant, unnerving presence. But the cabin held, a testament to Caleb's careful craftsmanship. He and Leanne fell into a new rhythm, one of vigilance. They took turns sleeping, one always awake to tend the fire and listen for any change in the animal's behavior. The shared threat had irrevocably broken the silence. Words, once absent, began to emerge, haltingly at first, like the first shoots of spring grass through frozen ground. She spoke in broken, fragmented English, piecing together her story with words and expressive gestures. She pointed to the east, to a great water, and made the shape of a ship with her hands. She spoke of a family, of promises of a new life, a husband she had never met. Then she drew a finger across her own cheek, mimicking the bruise, and her eyes grew hard. The story needed no more words. Caleb, in turn, found himself speaking more than he had in years. He told her about the mountain, not in poetic terms, but in the practical language of a man who lived in harmony with its brutal beauty. He explained the habits of the snowshoe hare, the way to read the clouds to predict the weather, the reason he built his cabin facing south to catch the winter sun. He spoke of his own past in clipped, spare sentences. A family lost to fever. A world of men that had offered him nothing but betrayal. A flight to the mountains that had been less a choice and more a necessity. They were 2 solitary souls, each scarred by the world in their own way, finding a common language in the heart of a blizzard. On the 10th morning, they awoke to silence. The howling had stopped. The wind had died down. Caleb cautiously opened the door, his rifle ready. The world was a pristine, breathtaking expanse of white, the snow piled in deep, sculpted drifts under a sky of impossible blue. The wolf was gone, having finally given up and moved on in search of easier prey. The air was clean and cold and utterly still. The immediate threat had passed, but its echo remained, having changed the very atmosphere within the cabin. That evening they shared their meal not in their usual separate spaces, but together at the table, which Caleb had set right again. The stew he had made tasted richer, the fire seemed warmer. The silence that fell between them now was not one of tension or uncertainty, but of ease and companionship. He found himself watching the way she ate, with a delicate, mindful grace. She looked up and caught his eye, and for the first time, a small, shy smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, chasing away the last shadows of the jail cell. Caleb felt his own lips twitch in response, a strange, rusty feeling. The cabin no longer felt like his shelter. It felt like their home. As the days turned into weeks, the iron grip of winter began to loosen. The sun climbed higher in the sky each day, its light holding a new, promising warmth. Icicles hanging from the eaves of the cabin began to weep, their steady dripping a quiet drumbeat marking the passage of time. The snowpack began to shrink, revealing patches of dark, sleeping earth. The path down the mountain, the path back to the world of men, would soon be passable. The knowledge hung between them, an unspoken and unwelcome truth. Their sanctuary, their self-contained world, was about to be breached. Caleb grew restless. He spent more time outdoors, checking his trap lines, his thoughts as turbulent as the thawing creeks. The idea of the cabin being silent again, of her absence, was a hollow ache in his chest he didn't know how to name. She too seemed to sense the coming change. A quiet melancholy settled over her. She would stand at the window for long stretches, looking down the valley towards the distant, invisible town. Was she thinking of leaving? The thought was a sharp, cold jab. He had no right to keep her. He had taken her to save her from the town, not to make her his prisoner. The choice had to be hers. One evening, after a long day spent tanning a deer hide, he worked by the firelight, his hands busy with a piece of soft leather and an awl. Leanne sat mending one of his shirts, the rhythmic pass of her needle the only sound in the room. He worked for hours, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was finished, he stood and walked over to the hearth. He placed a pair of small, sturdy boots on the stone floor. They were rough-hewn, lacking any real artistry, but they were strong and well-oiled, designed to withstand the rigors of the mountain trail. He had crafted them for her. "For the road," he said, his voice rough. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. "If you choose it." The silence that followed was heavy, profound. He heard her set aside her sewing. He felt her stand and cross the floor to his side. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight, bracing himself for her decision. He felt a small, cool hand cover his own massive one, which rested on the mantelpiece. He turned his head. Leanne was looking not at the boots, but at him. Her eyes were clear and steady, and in their depths he saw not a desire to leave, but a deep, unwavering certainty. She slowly shook her head, a small, definite motion. Then she lifted his hand from the mantel, her touch gentle but firm, and brought it to her own cheek. She held it there, pressing his rough, calloused palm against her soft skin. It was not a plea, but an answer, a choice. In that single, intimate gesture, she told him everything he needed to know. She was not leaving. She was home. The spring arrived in a rush of green and gold, a riot of life after the long, white silence. The snows melted, feeding the roaring creeks, and the mountain air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and pine resin. The world was reborn, and so were they. The cabin, once a refuge from the storm, was now the center of their shared life. A new, comfortable domesticity settled over them. Caleb taught her the ways of the mountain, showing her which plants were good for medicine and which were good for stew, how to track a buck, how to read the stories left in the mud by the passing of animals. She, in turn, brought a softness and a life to his solitary existence. She planted a small garden in a patch of sun-drenched earth behind the cabin, coaxing tender green shoots from the soil with a patient, knowing touch. She had a quiet, musical laugh that he found himself trying to provoke, telling her stories and watching for the way her eyes would crinkle at the corners. The memory of the tattered red dress and the grim jail cell faded, replaced by the image of Leanne in his deerskin tunic, her hair tied back with a leather cord, her face glowing with health and a quiet happiness. He never thought of himself as a husband or her as a wife. The words were from a world that had no meaning up here. They were simply Caleb and Leanne, two halves of a whole, their bond forged not by law or ceremony, but by a shared storm, a wolf at the door, and the slow, steady blooming of trust and affection in the heart of the wilderness. One bright morning, Caleb was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat against the mountainside. He paused, leaning on the handle to wipe the sweat from his brow, and looked over at the garden. Leanne was kneeling in the rich, dark earth, tending to her young plants. A gentle breeze lifted a strand of her black hair, and she tucked it behind her ear, her movements filled with an unstudied grace. She must have felt his gaze because she looked up, her hands still in the soil. Their eyes met across the clearing, a silent conversation passing between them. A slow, genuine smile spread across Caleb's weathered face, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his rugged features into something gentle and warm. And she, seeing that smile, gave him one of her own, bright and open and full of a quiet joy that seemed to illuminate the entire clearing. He gave a slight nod, a promise and a confirmation all in one, before turning back to his work. The axe rose and fell, the steady rhythm a song of their new life. High above, an eagle soared on the thermal currents, its sharp eyes taking in the scene below, the vast greening expanse of the mountain, the sturdy cabin sending a thin curl of smoke into the clear blue sky, and the two small figures, a man and a woman, who had found their entire world in each other.